Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending the HRPO Grand Round Series. We want to welcome Dr. James Campbell, who is our presenter today. He's a pediatrician and specializes in infectious diseases here at the University of Maryland, Baltimore campus. Dr. Campbell has worked on the Marshall Islands in Chile, Mali, and Ethiopia, and has lived and worked on Guam and Uganda, including 5 years with the CDC. He is currently also a vice chair here at the IRB. He will be presenting today on good clinical practices, a simple guide. Please welcome him for the presentation.
Thank you. Welcome. That was the intro for my international regulatory speech, so telling you all the places that I've lived. So today what I'm hoping to do is to have somewhat of an interactive session, not totally interactive, but not also totally just didactic. So when we get to if you have questions anywhere along the way, please stop and ask. You don't have to wait till the end. And there'll be some points where I'm going to bring up like a sort of like a scenario, a GCP scenario, and then we can discuss some of the issues. So we're all friends. No one's going to grade you or give you an authorization letter or anything from the IRB based on what you say today. So feel free to just speak up. Okay, so first, just overview of what I'm going to try to do today. Mainly what I'll do is just describe what good clinical practices are, sort of give you some definitions of that, and then take you through the principles within one of the GCP guidelines and give some examples of those. Most, maybe all of the pictures are from a study that we did in Ethiopia, just to keep your interest as we go along. Okay, so how could you define good clinical practices? Well, I mean, the first thing when I thought about this talk was good clinical practices. We're at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, right? So I'm thinking that I'm going to start a new campaign, which will be that we'll change the name, that we'll call it Great Clinical Practices here, right? Because good clinical practices, it sounds kind of mediocre, right? Who wants to be good at what they do? And all of you, I know, try to be excellent at what you do. So let's think about how we can optimize our good clinical practices and not just be good. But one definition would be that we're talking only about human subject research, right? We're not talking about laboratory bench research or animal research, but human subjects. And GCPs, you might define it as the ethical and scientific guidelines that we use to enhance the quality of the work that we do. And it starts from the beginning and goes through the entire process of everything that you do in clinical research. So that includes as you're designing your studies, and it shouldn't just be our sponsors who are designing the studies. Investigators, coordinators, and other people who are involved in research should be helping in that design, or at least have some hand before it's approved to try to make sure that the design meets the good clinical practice guidelines. And then as we conduct the studies, as we implement them, as we report on them. A lot of people think of GCPs only as making sure that you cross things out appropriately and your source documents are just right. That's not all that it is, but that reporting and recording of the data is a very important part of GCPs. And then as we're monitored, and both internally and externally, and as we're audited, those fall under good clinical practices. And the analysis portion. So here's something that most people don't tell you, and you don't find out for a long time until you've done research for a while, and that is there is no one ultimate resource or guide or rule or SOP or universally accepted set of simple instructions. I said that this was going to be a simple guide. I am going to choose some simple things that we can look at as a guide. But this isn't like a protocol. GCPs are not like there's one protocol out there and you're going to follow to the letter one person's, one agency's, one sponsor, one institution's guidelines. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it's a conglomeration of the practices that are put forth at many different levels. But as it says after that, most of the differences, sponsor to sponsor and guideline to guidelines, are variations on a theme. So they will almost always have major overlap between the different groups that say what their approach to GCP is, but there might also be differences. So you kind of have to know, what does your institution think? What does your sponsor think? What are the federal guidelines? All of those things. I tried to make it so that I have no acronyms. It's impossible. So it is important that we sort of understand what some of these acronyms are and where they come from. So what would make up most of that aggregate of what would be considered good clinical practices here at the University of Maryland, Baltimore? Well, those first two bullets are part of the federal guidelines. So the federal laws are written out in something called the Code of Federal Regulations. So everything that is in the Federal Register, there are books, essentially. They call them titles, and there are 50 titles in the Code of Federal Regulations, CFRs. That's what those first numbers are. Like when we say, and you hear this in every time you do city training, or anyone else who's really into regulatory issues is going to start quoting these things on you. That first number is the title, or the chapter or the book within the Code of Federal Regulations. And there are two places in there that mainly talk about how we deal in research with persons. The first one is for the Department of Health and Human Services, for HHS, or OHR, which OHRP would be sort of the overriding body of that. And that's the 45th title and Part 46. So all the regulations under that have to do with OHRP and HHS. And that's kind of the default, the way I look at it, it's like the default federal regs. So if you're not under the FDA, that's what IRBs use, that's what most people use. Even if the money that you're getting is not coming from feds, those are the regs that people are looking at that we want you to follow. And that is how Cicero and the SOPs and the checklists and everything that we use in the IRB were made, was using those regulations. Now, if you fall under the FDA, meaning you're testing foods and drugs, that whole section, food and drugs, is Title 21. The Title 45 is not just human subject research, it's all, quote, public welfare. So human subject research is considered part of the federal guidelines for public welfare. Okay, so all of those different parts, 1150, 54, 56, and 312, talk about the FDA, they talk about IRBs, and they overlap quite a bit with 45 CFR 46. But some things are slightly different. So you will see sometimes if you're doing your study under an investigational new drug application, that might be a drug or a vaccine or some other biologic, then those FDA regs will come into play. Now the FDA, unlike HHS, has for its investigators essentially a contract, and that's the 1572. And a little bit later in the talk, I'll tell you what each of those items in that contract are. But even if you don't work under INDs, if your studies are not drug or vaccine related, those topics, even though you're not signing that contract, those topics I think are important things for people to look at to see what's expected of an investigator when you work under good clinical practices. The next bullet is the International Conference on Harmonization. That's what most of this talk is going to be about, and it's going to be the 13 principles of the ICH section E6 that are the principles of good clinical practices. That's what we're going to talk about mainly today. Then we have our own policies here at the University of Maryland under the HRPP policies and procedures. And you're expected as an investigator here to follow those policies as part of good clinical practice. It may not say in the Federal Register that it's required that all outside monitoring reports are submitted as an RNI to your IRB within 5 days of receipt. It may say something else about making sure that you provide all new information to the authorities or to the agencies, but our rules say that's what's required. So those policies would also fall into a part of what's considered good clinical practices. That's why every institution has their own. All their sponsors, as the next bullet says, if you work with a sponsor, they will often have their own GCP guidelines, exactly how they want your dates written. Is it month, day, year? Is it day, day, month, month, year? You know, what is it? All of those they consider part of source document GCPs. And your department, your division, your institute may have its own GCP guidelines, rules, and regulations. So that's the body of all the places, or probably all of the places, where the information comes to play to account for what's considered good clinical practices. So our HRPO, the Human Research Protections Office, has this mantra, which you may or may not have seen, which is the culture of conscience, culture of compliance, which I really like. I think it wasn't here when I left for Uganda 7 years ago, but then when I came back, I saw this on lots of the documents. So what does this mean? To me, what it means is two different things, and they're like yin and yang. So culture of conscience has to do with the ethical side of it, and culture of compliance has to do with rules, has to do with checking all those boxes, following what most people think of as GCP. GCP to me is both. It means the ethical side, the what's right, what should you be doing, and have you checked all those boxes? Because the boxes are supposed to be there to make sure that we're following the ethical rules. I always like to throw a little bit of philosophy in it. It puts some people to sleep and it wakes other people up. So the way I look at this also is these are like two of the main frameworks, philosophical frameworks for ethics. The top one, the culture of conscience, is what people might call virtue ethics. So this probably started, or it's certainly made famous by Aristotle, and that is what makes something ethical. And he would say that what makes something ethical is, do you act in the way that a virtuous and ethical person would act? So it may sound like circular logic, but it's saying there are people, or there are ways that people act that are virtuous and good. That's the culture of conscience, doing the right thing, acting like a virtuous person. And there are some times where investigators, coordinators, and other people in research check all the boxes, make sure they follow all the rules, and they still do things that are not right for their participants or for science or for publications or for whatever, and they still look like they've followed the law. The second one, culture of compliance, would be more like, it's a big word, and if you're not into philosophy, you may not have heard it before, but deontology. So that's the rule-based form of ethics. So Immanuel Kant has made this famous, which is that what we do that's ethical is not based on just the sort of the perfect man, like Aristotle would say, the virtuous man. It's that there are certain imperatives, rules, duties that you need to follow. And if you follow those rules, you're ethical. That's the way regulators, auditors, IRBs, HRPOs, and other people would think that's what makes GCP. I have a list of rules, you need to follow those rules. The way I look at it is we have to do both. So does the IRB, and it's very frustrating sometimes for investigators and coordinators because often we focus too much on, I don't know about too much, but we do focus a lot on small picayune rules that seem not to make the big picture the ethical picture. But what I try to do, and I think there is a culture of this, is to try to make sure we're looking at both. Is, are we doing things ethical? Are we following ethical principles? And at the same time, that culture of compliance. Okay, enough with philosophy. Yes.
No, not quite enough.
Okay, please.
Can you give an example of where there was perfect compliance, but there was not conscience?
Yeah. An example that I would use would be something like, do you have all the 14 required elements in your consent form? So you say, here it is. It says what the risks are. It says what the benefits are. It says what the alternate is. It says what the purpose is. All of those things that we say you have to put in your consent form. While you're consenting someone, you go through all of that. But the way that you provide the information to them really biases them towards pushing the benefits and not giving them what are all of the risks. So it's a sort of a subtle way of saying, well, I did my duty. I did what it said I had to do. But you also, you're not you're in conscience, and I'd say, for the virtuous side of it, you didn't necessarily So things like that, I think, would be examples. And you could probably think of other things where people would check off all the boxes, but not necessarily it may not be the virtuous thing. And sometimes you have no duty sometimes to report certain things. And you could make the argument, you say, look, this is not something that I am required to tell my participants. But you may feel obligated to tell them, even if there's no requirement, because you think it's the ethical, the virtuous thing to do. So as I said, the framework for the talk is going to be on the International Conference on Harmonization, and there are 13 principles there. So this was in 1996, and there was a big meeting mainly focused towards pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, trying to have a standardized way that they could be sure that if they're doing studies across various countries, that they would be able to apply to the regulatory agencies in those countries and other countries and feel like they had a standard set of practices that Japan, the EU, the United States, and then other places would accept so that they could get their products licensed. And that's where ICH, International Conference of Harmonization, GCP, came about. So the first principle in the ICH principles is research should be conducted in accordance with the ethical principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki and that are consistent with GCP and the applicable regulatory requirements. So this is the overarching principle, and I think many of us, you go through your city training maybe every 2 years, you do things like this and other sorts of training. I think it is worthwhile if you haven't actually read the Belmont Report. The executive part of the Belmont Report is very short, but it goes through those 3 overarching principles. So here's my first interactive thing. Can anyone tell me any one of the 3 principles mentioned in the Belmont Report? Just shout out. Justice, beneficence, and respect for persons. Exactly. So you can't, those aren't rules, right? It's very hard to say like that the IRB would have a checklist of, okay, were you respectful of persons? Were you beneficent? These are ethical overarching principles, but they should then be reflected in narrower and narrower rules and regulations. Well, the Declaration of Helsinki has 37 clauses. So it has sentences, essentially, that describe what would be considered good clinical practice. It started in 1964. It's had 7 modifications over the years. The World Medical Association gets together every couple of years and updates it, and they just updated it last year. So I would recommend, that's an easy read also. It's very short. It's not very highfalutin. It's not quite as philosophical as the Belmont Report. I find that it's important as much as possible if you work in clinical research is to understand, probably no one completely understands the Code of Federal Regulations, but knowing the parts of the CFR that are helpful, that are part of what you do, will help you as you interact with the IRB and with your sponsor. You'll understand why the words come back from the IRB the way that they do in saying you are or not compliant with certain things, or why, for example, you're asking to waive consent. It's not just the IRB makes up how and when you could say I don't need to consent or I need assent. It's because we're quoting the Code of Federal Regulations. And you'd be able to see if you're trying to have a dialogue with the HRPO and IRB about, well, I think this would be a situation where I could waive or alter consent. The way that you can have that dialogue is to look in the CFR under waiver or alteration of consent, and it will say, what is the IRB going to be reviewing when they're considering if you can waive or alter the consent? And if you know what those are, you can say, well, here's why I think we fit into those. Or if you see, oh, we don't fit into those, then it'll be obvious why the IRB would say, well, then you can't have waiver or alteration, because we can't change those Code of Federal Regulations. And next is, I think it's important that in groups that do research, that when you write your standard operating procedures, that you consider the GCP principles. Now, luckily, where I work, I can't take any credit for it, but some other people in the room can. We have SOPs that completely every SOP quotes GCP guidelines. So you know where the information in that SOP, like what the background is behind that, why we've decided that this is how we'll do informed consent, and this is how we'll do our source documentation, and this is how we'll do each of the things that we do in clinical research. Knowing those guidelines help you to write your SOPs. And SOPs are difficult upfront things. In other words, it takes a long time to get them very good. But once you have a good set of SOPs, it's protection for you and the people that you work with when monitors, auditors, and other people come to look at your research. You say, this is how we do things. It's codified in our SOPs. We follow them religiously. If you need to change them, that's fine. But if it leads to fewer discrepancies where people say, you didn't store your approved consent form in the folder over here that we thought you should have. You say, here's the SOP that says where we store our approved consent forms. That's how you do it. I mean, SOPs give you a lot of protection, if you want to look at it that way, from the people who come from the outside to audit and monitor you. And, as I said, a lot of upfront work and a lot of yearly work because you're annually reviewing them to make sure it's actually the way that you do business. But in the end, it's probably work that's worth it. Okay, so here's one example of a clause that's in the Declaration of Helsinki. So when seeking informed consent for participation in a research study, the physician, now Declaration of Helsinki talks to doctors because it's the World Medical Association, and that's one of the criticisms people have of it is it's a very doctor-centric thing, even though it does make recommendations for IRBs and coordinators and other people. But it says, in a research study, the physician must be particularly cautious if the potential subject is in a dependent relationship with the physician or may consent under duress. In such situations, informed consent must be sought by an appropriately qualified individual who is completely independent of this relationship. So what that's saying is careful about the therapeutic misconception, careful about the times where you have a clinical relationship with someone and a research relationship with them. The IRB looks at this. You know, we want to make sure that when patients are deciding whether or not they want to be in research, that there's not undue influence put on them by their physicians. It's a very difficult thing for doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, everybody who works in the clinical world, because we're expected with our patients to act a certain way when we clinically work with them. And it is difficult to kind of partially divorce yourself from that when you're in the clinical realm and to say, you have to change a little bit how you allow the participant to make the risk-benefit calculus when it's in research versus in the clinical world. It's a difficult thing. And there are times where I think the physician, the nurse, the person who has the clinical interaction with the patient is the best person to be able to consent them. And there are other times where it may be best that that person kind of, again, divorces themselves and lets someone else give the objective risk-benefit calculus. Those are times when you could have approval as a doctor or as whoever, as someone in the clinical world to be the person to do the consent, but it's possible that you would not do it in an appropriate way. You have to be very careful, and I think you have to think about that. I do mainly studies that are not patients, they're healthy volunteers. But I know that there are ways that either subconsciously or consciously I could try to convince people that they ought to be in the study. And it's difficult for me to make sure that I don't try to be put on too hard of a sell for my study. I think in my mind this vaccine is probably as safe as flu vaccine. Do I know that for sure? No, but I think it is. Should I say that to people? Look, it's only gone into a couple hundred people so far. I think this vaccine is super safe. And you might be protected against the next pandemic. I mean, you decide. So you can kind of weigh it like that, or you can make it more balanced. And it's difficult. And if this was my patient, I might say something different. And I might try to push people the way, not we do still want to have a balance when we're in the clinical realm, but it's a different balance. So I think that's something important for people to consider, both when you have patients and healthy volunteer. Okay, so next principle. Before a trial is initiated, foreseeable risks and inconveniences should be weighed against the anticipated benefit for the individual subject and society. A trial should be initiated and continued only if the anticipated benefits justify the risks. This is a very meaty little bullet here, and you can see there are lots of pieces in there that eventually turn into regulations. Like the trial can't be initiated, that's your first time going to the IRB, and continued, that's your annual review, unless someone has looked at the risk-benefit analysis. It's your job as the research team to do that first. It's the IRB's job to do that after you submit it. IRBs and subjects care most about risk and benefit, typically. And by risk, we also mean discomfort, pain, inconvenience. And sometimes that's difficult. You get, we, all of us, get very excited about what we're doing. We know the science, and to us, that's a very important part, and it should be, of why we're doing this and how we're trying to advance things. But sometimes you have to take a step back, and no matter how exciting it is that you found a new molecule, a new blocker of that molecule, and how great it might work because of what you found in a test tube or in a genomic lab or in an animal, really what the participant is thinking about most of the time is, what does this mean for me? What might I get out of this? And what risks might I take on? And so you have to step back and sometimes think about that in how you describe those risks, both in the written form and in the verbal form. Honestly provide all the risks and benefits. And as I said before, it's somewhat easy to distort, either overtly or unknowingly, those risks and benefits, because you have in your head what they are. You don't necessarily know, unless you have a long-term relationship with the person who is trying to decide if they want to be in your study, you may not know what their level of risk aversion is. And this is something that's different often between clinical research and clinical medicine. If you're a primary care doctor and you've cared for someone for 20 years, you'll know them fairly well in terms of what sort of decisions, how can I help them to make decisions within their world. For me, I do, as I said, healthy volunteers. I have no idea. I have people, when I say, you have a 1 in 4 million chance of having anaphylaxis after getting this vaccine, they say, thank you very much, I don't want to be in the study. And I have other people who are like, 1 in 4 million. They don't even consider that, and it's not even in their calculus. So you have very risk-averse people and other people who are not very risk-averse. So in clinical research, we are required to tell people what we know. It's difficult to know where that balance is. Some people say, here are the risks, and it's like the index of Harrison's internal medicine. It's like every symptom that's ever occurred, millions of different, proportions and everything. That can be overwhelming, and that can be less information for the participant than giving them succinct things. It has to be a balance between those, and it's a difficult balance to come by. We know that. You know that. Sometimes the written part is way too long, but we know that the verbal, what goes on ethically between the investigator and the participant, is a succinct overview of those important, which are the important side effects, important risks, that sort of thing. Think about how you're minimizing the risks by your design and procedures. We expect that risks are minimized. That is, are you doing the fewest painful things, the least amount of blood you need to draw, the minimal risk that the person needs to have in order for you to answer the question to get the benefit from the study. When new information comes along, think about it in terms of the volunteer risk-benefit calculus. So what do I mean by that? So let's say, here's an example. At the start of a trial, it's not just an example, it's one of my trials. At the start of a trial, the only evidence that HIV PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis, so that's where you give antiretrovirals to someone who's not infected to try to prevent them from getting infected. The only evidence that it works is in monkeys. And there's great theory behind it. The drugs that we're using are safe. The drugs go to the genital secretions. The drugs are longer lasting than the old drugs used to be. Everything in the science mind, in the preclinical world, makes you think this is going to work. When people get stuck with a needle, you can give them post-exposure prophylaxis and prevent some of them from getting HIV. When you give mothers antiretrovirals, you can prevent the babies from getting infected. All of that makes you think PrEP, what I did 5 years ago, would work. But the only real evidence we had is monkeys. You explain that to everyone who enrolls. We had 5,000 couples enroll in the study. We tried to explain the best we could what we knew. 6 months into the study, there's another study going on with gay men. I was working in heterosexual, straight, married couples in Uganda and Kenya. This gay men study showed that PrEP worked. Okay, so now what do? I still have a year and a half at least, maybe 2 years left on my study. So one option is you do nothing. You just say, okay, that's nice information. I put that in my file and move on. You talk amongst the other investigators. Some people, and I can tell you when we were discussing this, said, well, it's not really doing nothing, but we decided if we were to try to give this information to the volunteers, I mean, these are poor rural people in Uganda and Kenya. Can they really understand? I mean, would they really be able to now incorporate that into their knowledge of, do they still want to be in our study? And, I thought that was not really a good approach, to think like we as the investigators and the sponsor could say, this is too confusing, so let's not tell anyone. But that came up. I mean, what about just give a grand rounds on how you think your trial is now going to succeed because somebody else did a similar trial and it succeeded. Tell your IRB, go to the IRB and give them that information. Discuss the issue with the participants. Reconsent the participants. Or stop the trial. You've already answered the question. PrEP works. Anybody have an opinion on what we should do? Yes.
Well, there's no reason to stop the trial because, as you wrote in your third bullet, that it works for gay men, but you don't know that it works in these straight married couples, and I think you can't extrapolate from one to the other.
Yeah, so in the end, that's one of the arguments we made for saying that we should not stop the trial, but there were people on the other side of the fence saying, maybe you should stop the trial. Like, how much different are they? And, should we at least maybe do a follow-on but have nobody left on placebo in your trial? But we agreed with you. There were 3 other trials going on of heterosexuals at the time that we didn't have the answer to yet, and we thought that would be important information. There was another one going on among IV drug users in Thailand, and another risk population. So yeah, we agreed with you. Do you think we should reconsent the participants?
Well, I think most of those bullets, such as discuss the issue with participants or reconsent, that always requires the step which is in your third bullet, which says tell your IRB. So I think the first thing you want to do is tell your IRB, and you can mention those ideas that you have, bounce them off the IRB, saying, we have considered discussing it with participants, we have considered reconsenting. And we say it's still up in the air, we haven't made up our minds, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, typically what we would expect at the IRB and what we did, but I agree with your approach, is we presented to the IRB what we thought the optimal approach was and gave the reasons behind why we thought it was the right way. And that is what we did. We went every time that there was a new trial that gave new information, we let the participants know. Now, not each time did we fully reconsent them, but we did go back to them and give them the results of the other trials so that it may be, again, that in their mind, that changes their calculus of that they still want to be in your trial, even if you say the entire trial should go on. Still, the individual participant has new information now that they didn't have before, and what we thought was important enough information that they should know as trials went on. It was very difficult because there were 5 trials, and 4 of them, I think, had results while our trial was still going on. So here's another principle. The rights, safety, and well-being of the trial participants are the most important considerations and should prevail over the interests of science and society. So, we're dealing with people, we're dealing with their specimens and their data, so their interests should trump. This is sometimes difficult when you're in the heat and the excitement of doing clinical research. You have pressure from your sponsors. They want you to get things done. You want to get things done. You have to think always that it's the people in your trial, that you're there to protect them. They expect you to protect them. What someone consents to is what they consent to. That may seem obvious, but I go back to the consent form fairly frequently when someone says, could we do this? I say, well, what did the person consent to? Let's look at the consent form. If they said that we can do it, then yes. If they didn't, if we didn't ask, then you can't do it. You know, if there's something in there about storing something, doing another test, moving samples somewhere, all of those things, if you didn't go through that with the participant, then you either have to reconsent them or you can't do it. Whatever they consent to is what you're allowed to do. I must say that many of these bullets did not come from me. I went around to some of the clinical coordinators that I trust and said, I'm giving a talk on GCP, and here are the topics I'm talking on. Tell me what you would teach a junior person, and what they taught me when I started. I mean, many of you, I think, are probably coordinators. Most of us investigators don't learn this from other investigators. We learn this from the best coordinators. So some of these are, even though I agree with all of them, that's why I put them in here, they're not all my quote points, but I need to make that clear. So be kind, gracious, and respectful. This is very important in every clinical trial that we do. And it's one of the reasons that trials work well, not just, again, that you check the boxes, but that you're nice to your people. Get alternate contact means. Having one telephone number, as you know, in Baltimore, it's very hard to get people if you only have one telephone number. You need other ways of getting in touch with people. Know what the rules are for safety reporting. Our IRB's rules, their sponsors' rules, the federal rules, the drug company rules may all be different. They may overlap in some way. If you're doing international research, it's probably quite different how you have to report things there versus here. You have to know all those. For my Uganda study, I needed like a little matrix for what the timing was for each of those safety reports. Provide a safety monitoring plan and then follow it, whether it's simple or complex. When you have very complex trials, multi-center, high risk, complicated design, those sorts of things, the expectation is that there's going to be like a board of people who are going to look at the safety. They're going to have a charter. They're going to follow that and then report at a certain interval. If you have a survey that you're doing, you probably don't need to have a big board of people that are reviewing things, but you still need a safety plan. So if your safety plan is once a year, the PI is going to make sure that no confidentiality breach occurred, then just do that once a year. But the IRB and the regs expect that you're going to have some kind of plan to monitor your safety. Very important, read and report global safety reports. Summarize them for the IRB and for your team. Some of you do research, I know, that is just single center, just your group. Others do multi-center, and some do both. When you do multi-center, some of these, as you probably know, there's 500 sites around the world. You're expected to enroll 3 people, and so are the other 500 sites. And people come to the IRB sometimes and say, we've had no adverse events, and they're continuing review. Well, just because your 3 didn't have an adverse event doesn't mean that the 9,000 other people around the world, the only way that you get that information is from these global safety reports. It might be an FDA IND report. It might be pharmacovigilance report from the drug company. It might be a DSMB. That's how you, as the investigators, and we at the IRB, know whether or not this drug is causing a problem, this vaccine, whatever it is that's in the multi-center study. So that's why we bug you about getting us the DSMB reports or getting us the IND, whatever the report is. So let's take another example. You're doing 10 industry-sponsored trials. The products you're studying are called Perfectonib, I'm a Wonder Drugumab, Optimab. Everything we get in the IRB is either a nib or a mab. That's why I'm bringing this up for the HRPO people. Superbonib and Topdogimab. Your sponsor sends you a new IB. You know, these come out every year typically. Any of you who work in the drug world, there's a lot of IBs. They're very long and complicated. So what are your options? One, should you file the IB in your with your essential documents with all the other study-related sponsor emails that are too long and too detailed for you to review? Should you read the IB changes and make sure nothing needs to be done? Should you send the IB to the IRB as an RNI, a reportable new information, with the reason for the RNI, quote, sponsor requires that we submit this stuff to you? Or, you can guess which one might be right, should you review it, then make sure there are no new risks or other information pertinent to your study, and especially to your participants, submit to the IRB with an explanation of the new items and why you're choosing to inform or not to inform your participants. That's what we at the IRB would think is optimal. You look through the IB, you say, there's nothing new. They changed the version number. They switched around the way this is done. There's a new contact person. There was one new study in an animal, and it says nothing new compared to what was before. Tell the IRB that. A lot less frustration on the IRB side when you say, here's the IB, and here's what's different about it now versus the last time. And if you say, yeah, there's one new risk, but it's already subsumed under a risk that we had already described to the participants, we don't think we need to reconsent people, and say that. Sometimes what happens is the IB comes out, and we didn't know this antibody causes people to get a neurologic problem, and you never told people before. You need to tell us this is a new risk. We have a new IB, and we're now going to reconsent people and let them know about the new risk. Questions? IBs, for those of you who don't work in this world, they're investigator brochures. So before a drug or a biologic or a vaccine is licensed, they have a précis, an overview of everything that's known about it, all the clinical trials, preclinical work, how it's manufactured, all of that. That's an IB. Once it gets licensed, then it has a PI, a package insert, or a prescribing information. So we would expect at the IRB that you're providing those to us, and sometimes there are updates on those package inserts as well. All right, the available non-clinical and clinical information on an investigational product should be adequate to support the proposed clinical trial. If you work with these investigational products or licensed products, you should be an expert on them. It's sometimes a little bit disconcerting when I, as the vice chair of the IRB, talk to an investigator or to a coordinator, and it seems like I know more about the product or the protocol than the person that I'm talking to. Like people don't know that there's certain side effects or whatever it is. I think the two people who should know the protocol and everything backwards and forwards, everyone working should know some about it, but the investigator and the coordinator. Right? Those, I think, are the key people in every study. Don't be convinced by web links, news reports, sponsor propaganda, government pressure. All these things happen. I'm a part of it. I know. Sponsors will want you to think that this is the best thing that's ever come out, and they have a press release on it. That is not where, as an investigator or clinical coordinator, you should think that the science is. Look for the science. Same with government pressure. I mean, we work at the NIH all the time. They tell us, you now, as a vaccine treatment evaluation unit, must do this next trial. I need to very carefully look at what that vaccine is and make sure that I understand what the risks are and that they have looked at the calculus of that risk-benefit ratio the way I would. Read the IB, read the package insert. When new versions come along, read and decide, don't merely submit. And know what's going on in your field. You don't want that there's stuff happening because you're not, you're just doing this because it's another study and it's not really what you're interested in. You don't want that there's new things that have occurred and you're not able to tell your participants and you don't find out until later or a news story. Okay, clinical trials should be scientifically sound and described in a clear, detailed protocol. Putting your protocol into a template and using a protocol other than Cicero, I would recommend for most studies. But putting it in a template assures that you include all the items. Every detail in the protocol should be known by the investigator and the coordinator. As I said before, I think being overzealous on SOPs is a good thing, a lot of work, but a good thing. Be type A organized. I know this is a generalization. I don't know how many people are investigators. I'm guessing most people are coordinators, but my overgeneralization is investigators, not meticulous. Coordinators, meticulous. You need, without a meticulous coordinator, GCPs become PCPs, right? Poor clinical practices. And I'm protected all the time by making sure that we have people that who are very good at the organization. Investigators have their own things that they're good at. They tend not to be good at making sure everything's where it belongs in a file, that when there's a due date that thing happens. Coordinators often are good at that. That's a characteristic of most coordinators. Don't assume anything. Always ask. There are no dumb questions. There's often different interpretations of the way things are written in protocols. If there could be multiple ways to interpret before you just go along and say, oh, I interpret it this way and I'm going to do this, you need to ask. And sometimes that ask has to go up to pretty high levels, like the sponsor. A trial should be conducted in compliance with a protocol that has received prior IRB IEC approval and favorable opinion. The fully detailed protocol, I think, is the best. It's not a guideline. It's not a suggestion. You have to follow the protocol exactly as written. And people try to fudge. Don't fudge. Try to avoid modifications. Make them before the submission whenever possible. You have to think through what you might want to change in the future. It's difficult, but the fewer modifications, the better. Even if you think what you're doing fits to the spirit of the protocol, like an exclusion criterion, if it doesn't exactly say it that way, you can't interpret it a different way. Follow your versions and note when draft amendments are approved and enforced. This can be very difficult when you have multiple changes that are going on, where you've been going along with the same protocol version, something changes, and then there's still copies of that old one around, or still copies of the old consent. You need a system so that you make sure once a change is made that only the changed approved documents are now being used and enforced. Learning Cicero as best you can, I think, is important. Ask questions, understand the details of the process. It helps. So here's another example. Protocol states that serum creatinine must be within gender-specific normal range for your lab. The, quote, unstated reason for including this criterion, this is another example from a study I'm currently doing, is to exclude those with renal insufficiency. The lab norm is from 0.76 to 1.27 milligrams per deciliter for men. You have a potential male, and his creatinine is too low, 0.72. His kidneys work too well. The only reason that you have this in there is to prevent people from having renal insufficiency, high creatinines. But what it says is you must be within the gender-specific norms for the lab. Can you enroll him? What do you think?
The answer to the first question is no. And the answer to the second question is that, of course, you should have thought of that before. But if you think that this is something that's going to come up on a regular basis, then you may want to submit a patient request to say that serum creatinine must not exceed the gender-specific normal range for the lab.
Right. Unfortunately, you're stuck, and this happens fairly frequently, as you probably know. If you don't carefully look before you submit that protocol that has eligibility criteria at all of them to make sure there's not something weird in that like this, which at first glance you might think that's fine, but then when you think about it, a person who's normal might still be excluded. So yeah, I think you can make a protocol amendment, but at this time you wouldn't be able to enroll them. Medical care given to and medical decisions made on behalf of participants should always be the responsibility of a qualified physician or a qualified dentist. Do not allow assistants without adequate training, licensure, et cetera, to make clinical decisions. And in my world, it's especially difficult with those very intelligent research assistants. We get people who work at our place, and I'm sure everyone does, young, very smart, very good people who work in clinical research, but do not have a nursing license, don't really have any medical background, but they pick things up very fast and they're really good. It's tempting for them to do more and more in your study. There has to be a line at some point that those research assistants cannot act like a nurse, a doctor, a PA, anybody who has training in those. Or that there's a lot of oversight and that you write up what those things are that they can do. But clinical decisions, no. Document that you, the investigator, made the decisions on eligibility, on treatment of adverse events, intercurrent illness, determining how to follow up a lab abnormality. All that documentation is very important. Each individual involved in conducting a clinical trial should be qualified by education, training, and experience to perform his or her respective tasks. So develop or use a good form for delegated responsibilities. For anyone who has a clinical trial, you should have a form that's a signature log with delegated responsibilities. The PI should be saying what everyone who works in the study is allowed to do. I find those forms often not very good. The one from the government I don't think is very good, but we use it because we're forced to by the sponsor. Use whatever form you have to, but make sure that you're clear on what it is that each person in the study is allowed to do. Carefully track training, licenses, certificates, etc. This is very easy to let these things lapse. You forgot somebody doesn't have their city training, you forgot to update someone's license, whatever the training is that's required. If the FDA comes, bad news. So if other monitors come, it can be bad news. So you have to have a system to track those things. Form 1572 from the FDA for the IND studies, and as I said, similar principles even if you're not in that, working with the FDA, and know what the persons are permitted to do on your protocol and in your region. So can a smart person with a bachelor's degree in history take vital signs in your clinic? What do you think? Would you let someone take vital signs in your clinic? Yeah. Any caveats?
Well, they have to know how to do it.
Right. How would they know?
Because they've done it in the past.
Right. Done it in the past. You've trained them. You've documented the training. You know, maybe you have some supervisory period with them. If they, if they don't have some official training, right? If they have a certificate, if that's what they do, fine. But if we're just talking about, I went to college, I got a BA in history, and now I want a job, and I'm working in your clinic, you have to show that they're able to do whatever that skill is. What about if you train a person who's not a nurse, medical assistant, EMT, et cetera, to draw blood? Is that okay? It's a little more invasive than the vital signs. Can we have the same person or a similar person draw blood?
When you say trained, do you mean have they taken a certification or?
I may mean both or either. What do you think?
Certified, yes. If they haven't, no.
Do you think it's the state law, or is it your clinic, or just do you think it's the right thing?
Right thing.
Yeah, so I think most people would want the people who are drawing blood, either they're a doctor, they have it through their official training, or they were trained as a phlebotomist, and you can get a certificate that you're a trained phlebotomist. Turns out in the state of Maryland, I looked it up before the talk, it's not required. There's no state law. There's only 5 states where you absolutely have to have a certificate to draw blood. So it would be okay, like legally okay, to have people who draw blood who don't have a certificate. But I think if you were going to do that, you'd want to work through your sponsor, through your institution, make sure you don't have an institutional rule against that, and then have good documentation for that training. Like, here's what we did. I trained this person over this period. We watched, took a test, did whatever. So your own kind of certification. So it would be legal and probably okay, but I think most people would prefer to have that certificate to be able to cover themselves. Can a nurse do a physical exam? What if the only thing is to check for axillary lymph nodes? That's from my study right now, too. The only part of the only thing I have to do on people when they come back after they're vaccinated is armpit checks. So I wash my hands a lot every day. Can I have a nurse do it instead of me? It depends. For this federally funded DMID, NIH study, only a licensed clinician, so that's a nurse practitioner or a doctor, who's on the 1572, can perform any part of the physical exam. Now, vital signs are okay, but the physical exam, and they consider just sticking my fingers in people's axillae, the physical exam, has to be a doctor. So you could, as long as you show, as the investigator, you say, I've delegated that responsibility. This nurse or whoever it is you're delegating to, knows how to do that part of the physical exam. In theory, it's okay, but it all depends on what your particular study is all about. Your study has lots of screening labs. Can a nurse coordinator interpret the results of the screening labs? What do you think? Nurse coordinator, can she interpret the results? So you get a hemoglobin back that's 11.4 for a 24-year-old woman. Can she say it is or it isn't anemic, or they can be in the study or they can't be in the study? Anybody have an opinion? What do you think?
I think they should submit it to the investigator. And they could certainly do a lot of preliminary interviews.
Yeah, I think that's the way most people would do it, is that the coordinator is often doing, like you said, some preliminary things, like saying, Doc, all of these are normal, and there's this one abnormal one. We have to decide what to do with it. But the typically official interpretation of what needs to be done is in the realm of the investigator and not the coordinator. But again, I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast rule, but I would just be careful that if there is no rule, that you do the most conservative thing, or that you document the training or the ability of someone to do whatever it is that you say that they can do in the study. These are the things that are on the Form 1572. So, they're reasonable to look at even if you're not doing IND studies, that you conduct a study per protocol. You personally, as the investigator, conduct and supervise the investigation. And you can look at all the other ones, but it's all the things that you would normally do. Freely given informed consent should be obtained from every subject prior to the clinical trial participation. And that means prior to any and all study-related activities except describing the study to people. So you can't do tests, you can't do anything preliminary, including screening, unless people have consented to that. Revise with any new pertinent information and decide if reconsenting is needed. There are many ways, as we've said, to exert undue influence. Illiteracy, translated consent, impartial witnesses are important things to think about in some studies. And of course, you need all the elements of informed consent. So you really want to meet your enrollment targets. You are the main one consenting or explaining the study. The consent form says you may be protected against Ebola if you get this vaccine. We're about to do an Ebola vaccine, if you didn't know. You may not. It also lists a number of possible side effects. So do you, one, talk slowly and passionately about the great protection in non-human primates, that other similar vaccines have been completely safe, and then gloss over and seem dismissive of the risks? Use the trust and the white coat that you're wearing to convince the participant that all will be okay. These are the sorts of things I'm saying, and I feel this pressure every time I don't know, pressure is the right word, but I do think about this when I'm talking to people, is I could potentially be a little more convincing. And where I put that line, I think everyone who's in clinical trials should be thinking about that. Like, you can't say everything, and you don't want to overemphasize the risks when you don't think you should. You don't want to overemphasize the benefits, but you do need to think about where that balance is. I'm going fast because time's kind of up. All clinical trial information should be recorded, handled, and stored in a way that allows its accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification. Notes to file can be very helpful when you have something that has occurred and you want to make sure that you're going to be able to remember what that thing was when the FDA comes 3 years from now. Real-time everything. Try to do your charting, everything that you write, immediately. Make reports whenever needed so that you know, like how many people you've screened, how many you've enrolled, what the reasons are for people not making it through the eligibility criteria. Ask questions exactly as they're written. You can't fudge on case report forms or source documents in terms of how questions are asked, because people have usually thought very, very hard about how you want the data to be put in the database, and that's why the questions are so specific, including eligibility criteria. Prepare fully for all visits, no surprises. This is one that one of my coordinators brought up as well. The more prepared you are day to day, we know tomorrow 11 participants are coming in, 3 for enrollment, 8 for follow-up, what the forms are that are needed, what blood tubes are needed, where they're all going to go, how many people we need. All of that helps a lot in terms of not making mistakes. Document per sponsor guidelines exactly as they say, and as you know, this can get super duper picayune, but you just have to follow those guidelines. Pilot your CRFs. Sometimes what you think of as clear fields are not clear at all, and make sure that your essential documents folder is always up to date. So here's an example of something that might not be clear. This is on one of our forms right now. A data field has a date and then 4 check boxes below that. One of them says exact date, the other one says unknown year, unknown month, unknown day. Okay? So now you have a 40-year-old who comes in, they're diagnosed with nearsightedness at the age of 5, probably in 1969 or 1970, and he remembers getting glasses just before starting kindergarten. Now you're supposed to document that. What do you put? Do you check exact date and come to an agreed upon exact date with that participant and say, well, you may not know exactly when it was, but let's just put in 12th of August, 1970. Do you check unknown day and guess on the month? Do you check unknown month and put 1st of September as a guess? Do you check all of the unknown boxes since you don't know any year, month, or date? Does anybody have any other thoughts? This is a DMID NIH form that we're supposed to fill out. It's not that easy to know what those things mean. What do you think?
Try and think about those things ahead of time and write into your protocol how, like, if it's unknown, you use the 15th to middle of the month.
Exactly. So you want those instructions there. And if you don't have those instructions, you should go back to the sponsor and ask. And if you don't know what the difference is, in this instance, what you're supposed to do is check off unknown year, because we don't even know the year, and then put the middle of your best guess of the year. So June 30th, 1970 would be what the instructions would say. But what you might think is clear, you don't know it's unclear. When you talk to the people who made these forms, they're like, this is obvious, you don't know which box to check. And you talk to everybody in the clinic, and they're like, I don't know which box to check. So that's why piloting your forms, you'll be able to figure out which box to check. Or you'll change the way that it's written. And they did change the way that this one was written. Confidentiality of records that could identify subjects should be protected, respecting privacy and confidentiality rules in accordance with regulatory requirements. So it's good whenever possible to keep codes away from coded records. That's a way to keep things more confidential. Prevent hard copy and electronic loss of confidentiality. In the IRB speak, people sometimes confuse confidentiality and privacy. What we mean in the IRB and in the regs, privacy means how you, when you are with a participant, how the information that they're giving you, everybody else doesn't get to hear. So typically what we're talking about is, I'm not now going to ask all of you what your medical history is in the presence of everyone else. It's in a separate place, quiet place, single one-on-one. Whereas confidentiality means once I could collect that information, I don't let anybody except allowable people to see it. Let the participants know how you'll protect their information, but I also always let them know there's no way I can give you 100% assurance. Someone could hack into a computer, could steal something. The greater the potential risk of the loss of confidentiality, the greater the burden, the protections. In other words, if I'm doing a survey asking you, do you like vanilla or chocolate ice cream, and that's the only thing I'm asking you, then when I look at that in the IRB, I'm not looking for super duper confidentiality, nobody could ever hack into your system. But I'm asking you about, do you do drugs, and do you, have you ever killed someone, and what are your sexual practices, and do you have HIV? And I'm keeping that on some web cloud. Okay, now I'm looking to see how is it that you're going to make sure that no one else can get into that information. Investigational products should be manufactured, handled, and stored in accordance with GMP. Careful records should be kept for all product handling, as all of you who work in this field know. You have to have storage oversight every day of the year, every hour of the day, and you have to know how your product is going to be destroyed. I'm not going to do that one. Last one is quality management, maybe the most important one, and that is you need to have procedures to make sure that you oversee the quality of your trial. Monitor your trial early. We all have a love-hate relationship with our monitors, and that is we love them because they make sure we don't make mistakes, but we hate them because they're so difficult and they find all the mistakes. But the earlier you monitor, the fewer mistakes you make. If you wait until you're 6 months in, then all those things you made, you just keep making them over and over again. So you want your monitor or internally monitor yourself after the second person or the first person that you see. Pilot your CRFs. Your whole team should have improvement input. If only the coordinator and the investigator are saying this is how we can make the study better, it's not going to get that much better. But if you ask the people who work in data management and you ask the people who are doing like inviting the people into your clinic and all of them, they usually have very good ideas about efficiency, but they won't tell you unless you ask. So ask them. Stakeholder input in development and throughout, meaning people who are, like if you're working with people who are gay men with HIV, ask those groups how, when you're in the development stage, how it would be best for you to start your study. You need adequate resources, obviously, and it's important to make sure that whenever you have visits, that you put windows around those visits. If you say people are going to come back at day 7, 14, 21, and 28, they have to come back on exactly day 7, 14, 21, and 28. Make a window that's a reasonable amount of time that scientifically makes sense. You expect the FDA is going to come when your trial ends. What might be good preparatory things to do? An internal quality management plan? Yep. Frequent, tough as nails monitoring visits? Yes. Review of common FDA 483s. Those are notices that you get from the FDA that you screwed up. Look and see what they typically give to people. How do other people screw up? It's probably the same way you're going to screw up. So if you can look at that online, and it's very helpful. Notification of HRPO of the expectation of an FDA visit. You should definitely do that. They will help you a lot. Do your own mock inspection, or potentially even hire someone if you have the money to mock inspect you, to pretend they're an FDA inspector. And reviewing with your team all the known sticky points and refreshing your memory on the approach. This is what I've done every time I've been inspected, and that is we go back over and say, remember that patient who had a psychiatric illness? What did we do with her? Remember that patient that had an SAE and died? Where's the documentation for that? Remember that one time where the study product went out of range? What did we do? Let's look back at our notes so that when that inspector comes, I'm ready. I've already refreshed my memory on all the issues that have occurred. You probably all know about ALCOA. Everything needs to be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. And just to end, as I said, a culture of conscience, a culture of compliance. And these two quotes from the Declaration of Helsinki, I think, are very important. The interests of science should never take precedence over the well-being of the subject. I want to thank the HRPO, the IRB, especially my CVD colleagues who helped me so much with this, and then Dr. Rosenthal, Gerald, and Edelman, and all the participants in all the trials that I've done. Sorry, I'm a little bit over. Thank you for listening and participating.